Have you ever wondered how you would do a painting of snow? Here's a really nice picture that was submitted by Joanne. So let's take a look at how we would approach it, simplify, and paint it. Before we get started, I went ahead and printed out a copy, because that way it's easier for me to look at. Now we have a lot of really wonderful elements that we can apply into the painting. The only problem that I see here is the big tree in the center. So at this time, we don't even need to worry about it. And later on, we'll just move it over to the side. Because where it's placed right now can be a little distracting, and we want to bring the viewer into the painting and not block them right at the tree. I'll be using a small piece of 300-pound cold press Arches paper, and I've already gone ahead and taped the sides with artist tape. For just a moment, I want to take another look at the sky and see what colors I want to use. For the sky, I'll use a little French ultramarine blue. You'll want to make sure that you take the water first, place it in your palette, and then add the color to the water. Then blend it well. Make sure that you break up any little chunks of color. I'm also thinking, what cool blue do I want to use for the shadow in the snow? I'm wondering, should I use a cyan, a Winsor blue green shade, or an Antwerp? The best thing for me to do is just test the color. So I'll just take a little bit and place it in my palette. Using just a little clean water, I'll just pull it out further into the palette and see if I like the hue. Now we could make these all work, but if you notice, the French ultramarine blue is a little warmer. And if you want to cool it down a little bit, all you need to do is take some of that cooler blue and mix it in. Now it's time to start the painting. I've already gone ahead and taped the edges with artist tape, so I have a nice clean frame around my painting when I'm done. And this time I'm going to be using a number 60 flat wash modeler. It's a synthetic brush and it'll lay down an even layer of water. The reason why I'm using this is because I don't need a puddle on the surface this time, and I want to control the color just a little more. You can see how if I don't carry the stroke all the way through, it can leave some brush lines. So to prevent that, I'm going to come back in with a little more water and color and move the paper around and see if I can even it out. Then I'll lift and tilt the paper and try to get a consistent shine on the surface. Since our goal is to create a snow scene, I need to leave the bottom half of the painting dry and the white of the paper. And to prevent any blossoming for going up into the sky, just wipe off the excess water along the tape. Another good tip is to tilt your paper at an angle and allow any of the excess water to run down and pool and then lift that out too. So while this is starting to dry, let's start thinking about our trees. So going back to the palette, let's use a little French ultramarine blue mixed with burnt sienna. And we also don't want to use too much water, otherwise we won't have control and it'll explode into our sky. So using a number 8 Sable Synthetic Blend, let's just apply a little bit of color to the horizon. We don't want the sky to be bone dry and we don't want it to be really wet. We just want it damp enough so it creates a diffused edge. The reason why we're using this technique is because, as you know, this is winter and the trees don't have their leaves, and if you look off into the distance you would see just a little blur of all the little branches. We don't want all the trees to be the same size. We want to give the impression of distance. So the trees in the foreground will be a little bigger and we'll work the size down to some smaller ones. As the surface is starting to dry, if it feels like the color's not spreading enough, add a little more water into your color blend. You can also tell that I'm not drawing the trees on. I'm just dabbing the color here and there. And for that smooth surface of the snow, I'll just use my brush and even out the horizon. Now let's take a look at the reference photo so you can see where we're at. We've already done our blue sky, and as you can tell from the picture here, you can see how that wet and wet technique worked really well to create those trees. Now let's start to add some of those other shadows and details. Using the same color that we just did for the trees, let's play with the amount of pressure that we apply to the brush. As you apply your stroke, press a little harder, then release. This way we have some variation, and it doesn't look like a straight line. It'll help to give the impression of some other vegetation that may not have been covered by the snow, or that's just peeking out. Using either a 1-inch flat or number 20 wash modeler, let's create some of those grasses. Now the colors that we can use are either a burnt sienna, a quinacridone gold, yellow ochre. It can even be some of the mud that you have in your palette in a very light value. Just be careful not to overdo it. We only want to suggest some grasses here and there. What's also nice is if you take some of that same color and pull that out into the distance. That way it helps to tie the painting together. To give the impression of cattails or other grasses that have a little tuft on the end, all we need to do is add a little dot on the top. Just barely touch the paper. You don't need to draw it on. Now using a little of the same blue sky color, along with that cooler blue that we had in the palette, let's add the shadows, all going in one direction. For that hazy sun in the sky, let's try lifting just a little color out using either a melamine foam eraser or a little water and a paper towel. You can wet the area first or wet the towel and just gently smudge. We don't need to scrub. And it doesn't have to be a perfect circle. We do want it round, but we only want to give the impression that it's there and we don't want it to distract from the painting. And if you like, you can always just clean it up with a little water and brush. Let's say that you want to create some other trees and details. All we need to do is go back to the palette and take the same basic color blend of French ultramarine blue and burnt sienna and hold our number 8 sable synthetic blend higher up the handle and loosely create some trees. We don't want them to be really straight. We want them to have just a little bit of a wiggle to them. You don't need to paint every little branch, just make a suggestion that there's some there. And to change the size or the stroke, try a different brush. Avoid really straight lines, because that's not very interesting. And it can be a bit distracting. In the original picture, if you remember, there was a big tree almost in the center. Now if we had it there, it would be distracting and that would be the first thing that we saw before we enter the painting. By having the trees on the outside, it allows us to enter and look beyond out into the distance. So you don't need to paint everything that you see or exactly like how it is. So let's finish this with just a few more shadows and remove the tape and take a look.